All right, let's dive into a story that completely flips the script on history as we know it. We're unpacking the central thesis of Michael Hoffman's book, The Occult Renaissance Church of Rome. Now, his work makes a pretty wild claim that centuries ago, the church went through a secret internal takeover, one that didn't just alter the past, but, as he argues, is still shaping our world right now. And right out of the gate, Hoffman hits you with this shocking central argument. He's not saying the Renaissance church fought against the occult. No, he's saying it became its main vehicle, that it actively absorbed these esoteric traditions that would totally transform it from the inside out. And that is the core idea we're going to explore today.
So to get our heads around this, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the counter-narrative itself, how it challenges the official story. Then, we'll get into the alleged occult infiltration. After that, we'll see how core church teachings were supposedly rewritten. Then, the really juicy stuff, the secrets Hoffman claims are hidden in famous Renaissance art. And finally, we'll connect it all to the present day.
Okay, so let's start with part one, this counter-narrative of Rome. The entire foundation of the book rests on one thing, completely challenging the standard history of the Catholic Church during what's supposed to be its golden age. Here's the key takeaway. The popular view is that the Renaissance was this amazing period of art and learning that made the church stronger. Well, Hoffman says, nope, it was the exact opposite. He argues that this explosion of new ideas actually created the perfect cover for an occult worldview to sneak in, subvert everything, and ultimately reshape the entire institution. And he doesn't just see this as history. He frames his own work as a sleuthing mission. He's not just looking at dates and names. He believes he's uncovering a deep internal conspiracy that's been running for over 500 years. So you have to ask, what's the evidence he presents for this infiltration? Well, that leads us right into the second part of his argument, how this infiltration actually happened. According to Hoffman, this wasn't an accident. It was a targeted subversion, and it was pushed by very specific philosophies and championed by some of the most famous people of the time. The first big philosophical weapon he identifies is Neoplatonism. Now, he says its impact was just massive. Why? Because it completely shifted the focus. It took the idea of salvation through God's grace, a cornerstone of Christianity, and replaced it with salvation through secret elite knowledge, what they called gnosis. This essentially put human intellect on the same level as God. The second major influence he points to is Hermetism. This whole system of belief was based on these supposedly ancient Egyptian texts from a mythical figure named Hermes Trismegistus. Hoffman claims this was the pipeline, the main channel that funneled pagan philosophy, magic, and all sorts of esoteric ideas straight into the heart of the Roman Church. And listen, this wasn't just happening in some dusty library. Hoffman lays out a timeline of key figures who were pushing these new ideas. We're talking about thinkers like Nicholas of Cusa, Marsilio Ficino, who was translating all these esoteric texts with the money and protection of the powerful Medici family, and of course, Pico della Mirandola. Hoffman sees Pico's famous Oration as the ultimate symbol of this whole shift, humanity basically trying to take over the role of God.
Okay, so if these new philosophies are taking root inside the church, what happens next? Well, Hoffman argues they led to a total rewrite of core church doctrines, especially on two really fundamental issues, money and truth itself. Just take a look at this slide on usury, that's lending money for interest. For centuries, the church was crystal clear. It was a mortal sin. But Hoffman claims that through these clever pastoral tactics and sneaky loopholes, like calling interest administrative costs, they basically canceled out the absolute ban. And this, he says, paved the way for the very first Catholic banks, approved by popes to charge interest.
But an even more mind-blowing shift, according to the book, happened with the whole concept of truth. The traditional view, from guys like St. Augustine, was simple. Lying is always a sin, period. But this was supposedly replaced by something called casuistry, this incredibly complicated way of reasoning that could actually justify being deceptive. Hoffman says concepts like equivocation and mental reservation were basically loopholes that let you mislead people without technically lying, which in his view made it okay to break oaths.
So here's the next big question. How do you pass on all these new subversive ideas to a select few while keeping the average person totally in the dark? Well, according to Hoffman, you encode them. You hide them in the most famous art and architecture of the day, basically hiding an occult worldview right out in the open.
And this is maybe one of the book's most startling claims. Hoffman argues that masterpieces we all see as the peak of Christian art, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel frescoes, were actually dual purpose. Yeah, on the surface, they show biblical scenes for the masses. But for the insiders, for the initiates into Neoplatonic and Hermetic ideas, they held a whole hidden layer of pagan meaning.
And get this, it wasn't some fringe idea that no one noticed. The author points to contemporary critics like Pietro Aretino, who wrote this absolutely scathing letter to Michelangelo. It just goes to show that even back in the 16th century, some people were looking at this art and thinking, whoa, this is not right. This does not belong in a holy place.
Now, let's talk about a massive symbol sitting right in the heart of the Vatican. 327 tons. Let that number sink in. That's the weight of the ancient Egyptian obelisk that Pope Sixtus V had dragged to the center of St. Peter's Square. It was a monumental feat of engineering. Now, the official story, the one we all hear, is that putting a cross on top of it symbolizes Christianity's victory over paganism. Makes sense, right? But Hoffman flips that on its head and asks a really provocative question. Considering the absolutely overwhelming scale of this pagan, pharaonic symbol, could its true meaning be the exact opposite? Could it be a declaration of Hermetic Egyptian philosophy's dominance over the Church? And this brings us to the final piece of the argument. This is where Hoffman connects this 500-year-old story directly to the Catholic Church today, arguing that the legacy of that Renaissance revolution is not only alive, but thriving. He points to a whole series of modern events that he sees as the direct result of this alleged infiltration. We're talking about things like the Second Vatican Council's document, Nostra Aetate, which completely redefined the Church's relationship with Judaism. He also cites what he calls the rehabilitation of the Pharisees and other major theological shifts that, in his view, all lead to one thing, the subordination of Christ's sacrifice to more modern historical events. And this simple chart really boils it all down. It visualizes his core argument about this legacy. He contends there's been this fundamental shift in what the Church prioritizes. The absolute supremacy of Christ's sacrifice, which was everything to the pre-Renaissance Church, has been, in his words, steadily chipped away at over the last 500 years. So for Hoffman, the final takeaway is this. These changes aren't accidents. They're not just a natural evolution of thought. He is arguing that they are the result of a deliberate, long-term agenda carried out by an elite clerical class, the modern heirs of this Renaissance occult movement, who don't see the Church as something to be preserved, but as something to be actively molded to their own ideology. And that's really what it all comes down to. At the end of the day, Hoffman's work leaves us with a profound question. It doesn't matter if you buy into his thesis or reject it completely. It's a direct challenge to a foundational story of Western civilization. It forces us to ask, what happens when a story this old and this radical challenges the very history we thought we knew?